year was 1905. I held a conference at the White House. I invited college coaches and college presidents. Famously, Walter Camp. Some consider him to be the father of modern football. He was a player coach at Yale. Built the program at Stanford. Football was a very different game in that year. The first down was 5 yards, not 10. And the forward pass was illegal. The entire game was this violent scrum in which boys did horrible things to one another, especially if they thought themselves outside of the view of the umpire. There was a play called the flying wedge, by which the offense would start at a run from some 20 yards away from the line of scrimmage, forming themselves in the shape of a wedge and putting the biggest and strongest boys at the point of the wedge and aiming that at what they perceived to be the weakest part of the defense. When the collision occurred, the defense required to await the collision at the line of scrimmage. Very often, the smallest boy inside of the wedge would be given the ball and taken by his teammates and thrown bodily over the defense, sometimes accomplishing the entire 5 yards at a first down. But very often, landing on his head or his neck, voice would drop with a heavy knee behind the neck, spikes to the head. In 1904, over 20 young men died playing college and semi-pro football. But the game had been discontinued at Harvard, my alma mater, by President Eliot, and the state of Georgia considered legislation to outlaw football. The parents of a boy deceased on the gridiron made their way to Atlanta to testify against the legislation. Their boy so loved the game. I told those men at the White House, men, the game is on trial, and unless you come up with rules for the safety of the players, the game may be outlawed. And so I said I would rather keep the game with the violence than lose the game altogether. After all, life is like football. No flinching, no fouling, and hit the line hard. Chastised, those men went away, held more meetings. In 1906, new rules for football. 10 yards for first down. The forward pass now legal. It spread the game out. It's the modern game that we watch on Fridays and Saturdays. Shame upon us all. Sundays, too. Mondays and Thursdays, I think, now, too. That was the beginning in 1906 of the National Collegiate Athletic Association, headquartered now in Indianapolis. The highest award of the NCAA is the Theodore Roosevelt Public Service Award, given to some public servant who, in his or her youth, had been a college athlete. You fans of the gridiron out in North Dakota very often were fans of the Minnesota Vikings. One of the winners of the Theodore Roosevelt Award was Alan Page, the Hall of Fame defensive player for the Purple People Eaters. Well, that was just a bit of a vignette while we waited for some of those that arrived right on time for the beginning of the program. I wonder if you'll indulge me, now having found your seat, if you'll all join me and stand. The American colors are just beyond. It's a bit late in the afternoon, but we didn't go to school this morning, did we? How about we all join together and get properly started? That's the way to do it, gentlemen. Remove your caps. You know the words. I hope your grandchildren do too. Would you repeat with me? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I thank you kindly. And I would just ask that for those who have served, if you're a veteran of the United States Armed Forces, a reservist or active duty, would you take this moment to stand that we might give you thanks? Any veterans active duty? Because I was a short-timer in the United States Army, we declared war against Spain in the cause of Cuba Libre, mustered in, trained in San Antonio, transported to Tampa, made our way to Cuba, fought the battles, returned to Montauk Point, Long Island, quarantined, and were mustered out, all in less than 6 months. Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war. As I toured the countries, your president, so very often, I saw the members of the Grand Army of the Republic, those veterans of the Civil War. I said, you fought in the Great War when there was too much war to go around, and we fought in the Spanish-American War where there was too little war to get around. So we were actually fortunate, the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, to get into the war. fortunate to get out again, and then for me to rise like a rocket. I'm seeing familiar faces here, those that have suffered through my presentation previously. And right here, Mr. Bill O'Keefe, he's graduated from the back row in the first show to the front row in the second show. I promised him I would tell him some new stories this afternoon, though we're of an age where we've probably already forgotten the morning program, haven't we? It's a wonder that I became your president, and that I'm known as your conservation president, that I'm known as your first cowboy president. Until recently, I could brag that I was the only president born in New York City. But the other fellow of some recency, he's from Queens. I'm a Manhattan boy. Growing up in New York City when I did, born in 1858, why, even then a child could find nature in New York City. We lived very nearby Gramercy Park. And one of our great playgrounds was Mr. Olmsted's great Central Park, with the American Museum of Natural History right next door. The charter for that great museum was signed in the Roosevelt family living room when I was a small boy. My father recruited its first full-time director. Its collection includes an Egyptian plover that I harvested along the Nile when I was a boy of 13, and a snowy white owl harvested at my home Sagamore Hill in beloved Oyster Bay, Long Island. The eastern edifice and great hall of that museum are the official New York State memorial to my life. And some of you, perhaps, if you've watched some movies with your grandchildren, you might have seen a fun little movie, a farce that was set at the museum called Night at the Museum, where there's actually a man in the movie who pretends to be me. Imagine that, a man pretending to be somebody he's not. As a little boy growing up in New York City, my parents indulged this interest that my brother Elliot and I had in natural science. And we would spend a good portion of the day wandering through the parks or along the wharves of the East River and Hudson River that define lower Manhattan Island. And all along the way we collected snakes and bugs and turtles and birds, squirrels and rats and mice, alive or dead, it did not matter. We brought these creatures home and had on the fourth floor of our home something that we called Roosevelt's Museum of Natural History. A very wide-ranging, there was any mother might suspect, a truly malodorous collection. You had to be careful coming to my house. If you poured yourself a glass of water from the pitcher, a snake might fall out of the pitcher into your glass. Well, that's where I was keeping my snake cool. If you reached into the icebox for a snack, you might pull out my collection of mice awaiting my experiments. One afternoon, I was walking up Broadway Avenue. I saw Mrs. Hamilton Fish, wife of the United States Secretary of State, walking down. A very important woman. I thought I should have some display of gentlemanly conduct, in hopes that a report of my gentlemanly conduct might go home to my mother, much to my own benefit. Pride before the fall. As I passed Mrs. Fish in the street, I tipped my hat and wished her a good day. And when I did so, 2 frogs fell out from beneath my hat and fell upon her shoes. I'm afraid that the report that went home was not of my gentlemanly conduct. I'm delighted that the O'Keefes are here with me. They're down from Grand Forks, North Dakota. Their son, Ed O'Keefe, is the president of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, a $500 million project being built in a little town of 150 people in southwestern North Dakota. And since 1947, Medora, North Dakota has been the gateway to Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And since 1965, the home of an evening entertainment in the outdoors in those beautiful Badlands called the Medora Musical. Over 4 million people have seen that entertainment in that little town. And Lawrence Welk, that son of North Dakota, used to come and get talent for his television show from the stage of the Medora Musical. Every year, some 800,000 people already visit the national park, and on July 4th, 2026, under the leadership of Ed O'Keefe, we'll cut the ribbon on that presidential library, unlike any other presidential library in the country, for this beautiful museum. The architects are Snohetta from Oslo, Norway. Somewhat fitting. I think some 60% of North Dakotans have Norwegian heritage, and they've got the lutefisk to prove it to them. The architects did the Oslo Opera House, and the 9/11 Memorial in New York City. Like the Oslo Opera House, this museum will be buried again beneath the prairie. Horses and cattle will graze on what used to be United States Department of Agriculture grazing grasslands. And we hope that you might come and visit and be inspired to live boldly and dare greatly. I wrote of my time in the Badlands that was there that the romance of my life began when I was a young cattle rancher. I achieved a small fortune in cattle ranching, but in North Dakota you know how to achieve a small fortune in cattle ranching. Start with a big fortune. That's the way it worked for me. Lost half of my inheritance from my late father on the cattle ranches there. Mrs. Roosevelt, she said she didn't mind at all if I lost every penny for the impact that the Badlands had upon me. So much so that in Fargo in 1910, as a former president, I returned to North Dakota and told the audience in Fargo I would have never been president but for my experiences in North Dakota. The historian, our mutual friend Rolf Sletton, points out that the next day in Montana, I told the people there I would have never been president but for my experiences in Montana. Ed O'Keefe says, stop telling that part of the story. Well, I wasn't just being a politician, I was being an honest observer of the facts. My first ranch, the Maltese Cross Ranch, was about 5 miles south of Medora. My second ranch, the more famous ranch called the Elkhorn Ranch, named for the fact that when I first walked those bottomlands, many were the shed elk antler that we found. But of great importance, 2 pair of elk antler, demonstrating that the combatants had locked themselves in mortal combat, of course leading to the death by dehydration or wolves of those animals. Hence my naming the ranch, the Elkhorn Ranch. Some call it the cradle of conservation, for some of the early writings I did there with regards to the preservation of our wildlife and its habitat. Both of those ranches were about some 20-some miles away from the Montana territorial line. We had free-range cattle, no fences. The cattle wandered all throughout the mutual badlands that are between the area of southwestern North Dakota and southeastern Montana. So the roundups were primarily in eastern Montana. The stockmen's meetings in Miles City. My dust up with the Mingusville Bully is modern-day Webo, Montana. Why, there's a Roosevelt County up by Wolf Point up in the northeast of Montana. No Roosevelt County in North Dakota. So sometimes you'll find in my writings I actually refer to my ranch in Montana. I was being very inexact in that explanation. I, as a young boy, was homeschooled, and my lessons were taught to me by my Aunt Anna Bullock. She was a single lady at the time. She would eventually marry into the Gracie family that gives us the Gracie Mansion, the mayor of New York's home. My mother and my grandmother Bullock, all 3 of those women lived together with the family at 28 East 20th Street, and all 3 women were Southern women. Ed O'Keefe, well, he proves that it's not just lawyers that are produced at Georgetown University. He was a journalist and a writer. He's written a wonderful book. It's on the back table. It's called The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. Oh, it's not as steamy as the title implies. The book is about my mother, my 2 wives, and my 2 sisters. My mother, Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt, was from Roswell, Georgia. My parents were married in Roswell at Bullock Hall in 1852. The Bullock Hall still stands today. Roswell is one of the few communities in the greater Atlanta region where the antebellum mansions were not struck by Sherman's march to the sea. The reason being that when the Union colonel was sent to Roswell to seize the woolen works, he noticed that all of the mansions in Roswell, that the eaves and chimneys had been etched with the symbols of Freemasonry, and he himself, being a Freemason, spared those buildings from being burned. You can visit Bullock Hall and stand in the spot where my parents were married there in 1852. My mother, she was a Southern belle, the life of the party, quite a storyteller. When I was a little boy, I knew the stories of Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox and Brer Bear long before Joel Chandler Harris put the stories into writing. At a luncheon I attended in 1905 in Atlanta, I demanded that Joel Chandler Harris sit by my side, that I might make inquiries of him. He was quite a recluse, hardly ever attended public affairs, but did so much to my enjoyment in 1905. Oh, I should take a moment and prove my Southern bona fides. My great-great-grandfather, Archibald Bullock, was the revolutionary governor of Georgia. Would have signed the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, but raced back to Savannah to provide defenses against the invading British. Discovered dead at his desk the following year, suspected of being poisoned by British agents. My great-grandfather, General Daniel Stewart, fought in Florida against the British and the Indians in the Revolutionary War, returned to Florida to fight in the Second Seminole War, marching here with 5 sons, all 6 feet tall and taller. From my grandmother, my aunt, and my mother, I heard stories of my Uncle Jimmy Bullock, my mother's half-brother. He was the head of the Confederate Secret Service in Europe, built the Confederate raiders, the CSS Shenandoah and the CSS Alabama in Liverpool. And my Uncle Irvine fired the last cannon off of the Alabama in its fateful fight with Kearsarge off the coast of France. From my southern kin, I heard stories of kinfolk who hunted panther in the swamps, or who crossed the Savannah River to fight duels on points of death, points of honor to the death in South Carolina, where dueling was not yet illegal. Some historians say, if not for this infusion of Southern daring, do, and adventure, I might have just grown up to be another honorable, boring Dutch Reform businessman in New York City, as 5 generations of Roosevelts had honorably done before. When my grandfather, James Stevens Bullock, first proposed marriage to my grandmother, Martha Stewart, known as Patsy in the family, she refused the proposal, perhaps under the influence of her father, the aforementioned General Daniel Stewart, for she married shortly thereafter her father's elderly widowed friend, John Elliott. My grandfather didn't have much in the way of patience on issues matrimonial. The following week he married John Elliott's daughter, Hester Elliott. Well, the Bullocks in Georgia had family. John Elliott, meanwhile, was elected to the United States Senate by the Georgia General Assembly, served 1 6-year term, during which time my grandmother was reported to be a wonderful hostess, a fine mother to his children and their children together. Senator Elliott and Patsy, Senator Elliott and my grandmother retired to Georgia. Medicine and disease being what they were, Senator Elliott died. And then Hester Elliott Bullock died. Then my grandfather successfully proposed to my grandmother. And when they married, he was marrying his stepmother-in-law. If that doesn't make me a Southerner, nothing does. In the 1920s, an Atlanta newspaper woman, a journalist, she went to Roswell to interview the last surviving bridesmaid from my parents' wedding. Now quite elderly, her memories were vivid. She told stories of my mother, who was quite flirtatious, the life of the party, loved to dance and tell stories and flirt with the boys. She wrote up her newspaper story under the byline Peggy Mitchell. 2 years later, she published Gone with the Wind as Margaret Mitchell. You remember the opening scenes of Gone with the Wind? Scarlett O'Hara at the party flirting with the boys. Now, I'm not saying that my mother was a sketch for Scarlett O'Hara, but I'm not saying that either. My lessons, I was good at some subjects, literature, history, natural science, poor or average in other subjects like mathematics, Greek, and Latin. My father taught us our first and most important lesson every day. I would wait with my siblings, my older sister Anna, known as Babby in the family, my younger brother Elliot, called Nell, or Nellie, famous in history as Eleanor Roosevelt's father, and my youngest sister Corinne, called Coney. We would wait to see my father come from his bedroom, attired for his day at the office, in the business of Roosevelt and Sons. The Roosevelt being my grandfather, Cornelius von Schacht Roosevelt, known as CBS. The Sons, my father and his 4 older brothers. The business was the importation of plate glass from France at just the time when the first skyscrapers were being built in New York City. Giant buildings, 8, 9, 10 stories tall, and plate glass being utilizable for the first time in those iron buildings. And my father, he was called Greatheart in our family. Does anyone anymore read Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress? Second best-selling book in the 19th century in America, following the Bible itself. Of course, Bunyan writes by allegory. Greatheart leads Christian and other pilgrims past places with which we are familiar, or at least their derivations. Vanity Fair, from which the Thackeray novel and the magazine derived their name. The Slough of Despond, what a horribly sad place. And the place with the men with the muck rakes in their hands. Men so busy raking up the muck and mire of human existence, they fail to look up and see salvation offered before them. Hence the phrase I coined when I was your president, the muck-raking press. I was not paying a compliment to the yellow journalists of my day. My father lived the gospel. He was a founding member of the Children's Orthopedic Hospital, the first hospital to provide free surgeries for the crippled children of the day. A funder of the Children's Home and Aid Society, an organization that saw successfully the adoption of thousands of New York City orphans by Midwest and Western farm families. He was, as I mentioned, a founder of the American Museum of Natural History and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And on Sunday afternoons, my father would take one of us Roosevelt children by the hand and take us to the newspaper boys' lodging house, where the newsies, the orphan boys who spent morning, noon, and night on the filthy streets of New York selling newspapers for a penny or two apiece. Because of the work my father and other men, at night those boys had a warm and safe place to sleep, a good meal, and on Sundays Bible study taught by my father. Then the lessons by my Aunt Anna. I was tutored for an entrance exam to Harvard College, today Harvard University. And I would matriculate there in our centennial year of 1876. My father sending me off to Cambridge that freshman year with these words. He said, Theodore, first take care of your morals, second your health, and third your studies. My father was the only man of whom I was ever really afraid. But in a good sense of the word, I never wanted to disappoint my father. I would graduate Phi Beta Kappa, magna cum laude. My father only physically punished me but once. I remember the crime. I bit my older sister Bammy on the arm. I ran out into the backyard and in my attempt to escape justice ran into the basement kitchen, grabbing some dough from the cook and hiding beneath the table. The table so tall and I so short, I could stand fully erect beneath the table, nervously munching on my dough and awaiting my father. My father strode into the kitchen. I could see his legs from beneath the table, and he inquired of the cook as to my whereabouts. Now, like the O'Keeffes, the cook was an Irish woman, and the Irish have an honest contempt for informers. But duty-bound, she cast a glance beneath the table. My father dove beneath the table. I hurled the dough at his head. I turned and ran the opposite direction, made it halfway up the stairs, before being apprehended by the long arm of the law. And I must admit that the punishment that followed fitted the crime, and probably did me some good in the end. My father came to visit me my freshman year at Harvard and asked me that question that perhaps you recall being asked, or you've asked of your children as well. He said, Theodore, what do you plan to do with yourself, your profession? I said, Father, I think I should like to be a natural scientist. He said, Theodore, that's fine as long as you are not a dilettante, as long as you do serious work. The family had done well enough in business that my family eventually would not need to worry about its bread. If, however, Theodore said, my father said, if, however, you have a taste for jam and butter, you had better get about the plan for the jam and the butter. My father taught me this issue of home economics. If I wasn't going to do remunerative work and add to the value of the numerator of life, I must reduce my expenses and thereby reduce the denominator of life and keep the fraction of life constant. I promise no more math in this program. It's hard to put to words what a blow it was to me my sophomore year. My father, 46, died of stomach cancer. The entire city of New York was in mourning for his widow and 4 children, and I was in the most terribly foul mood, writing in my diary to my siblings that I thought I might go insane from sadness. My tutor, Arthur Cutler, knew that in the past, being outdoors and having strenuous exercise had not only often secured my health as an asthmatic, but very often my spirits as well. That summer he sent me to the north woods of Maine, to the great Roost country along the Penobscot River. And there with a hunting guide named William Sewell and his nephew Wilmot Dow, 2 men who short years later would join me ranching along the Little Missouri. We hunted and hiked and canoed. We climbed Katahdin, the highest point in Maine, famous today as the northern terminus of the Great Appalachian Trail. We visited the lumber camps, where my vocabulary was greatly expanded. And most mornings before we had our adventures, I took my own canoe to a place south of Island Falls, Maine, a place where the west branch of Lake Mattawamkeag River is joined by First Brook. And there in the early morning lights, by the sound of those waters joining gently, I began my day as my late father would have me do, with Bible devotion. In the years hence, the people of the state of Maine have seen fit to name that little point of land a state historic site called Bible Point. So named for the fact that I, as a young man, sought and found the wisdom, comfort, and solace in the good book there. I would later in life say that a thorough knowledge of the Bible was worth more than a college education. But I returned to Harvard to complete mine, throwing myself into my studies, but as many a young man of that age is wont to do, I fell in love with young Alice Hathaway Lee, the most beautiful girl in Boston. She was 17 years old at the time, the cousin of a classmate of mine. They lived as neighbors some 6 miles distant from Cambridge on Chestnut Hill. In my junior year, well-worn was the pathway between Cambridge and Chestnut Hill. So much so that in the spring of my junior year, I proposed marriage to Alice, and she refused me. In the fall of my senior year, I proposed marriage to Alice again, and she refused me again. But doggedness is as doggedness does. Persistence wins the prize. Oh, today you might call it stalking. In the spring of my senior year, Alice relented to my proposals, agreeing to be my bride. Now, I do understand that occasionally a married man has trouble remembering the date of his wedding anniversary. I took care of this. Alice and I were married on my birthday. We honeymooned but briefly. I knew that a man's first responsibility was to pull his own weight, to provide for his family. But I'm soured on natural science, at least the way it was being taught at Harvard in those days, where a natural scientist was supposed to be a man indoors in a laboratory, doing dissections beneath a microscope. Nothing like the great outdoor field work of John James Audubon and C. Hart Merriam and others that I admired and modeled. I enrolled in Columbia Law School, thinking to follow 2 of my late father's brothers who read the law, and soon became doubly frustrated at law school, where I discovered at law school, rather than teaching a lawyer to fight for righteousness and justice, at law school a lawyer is taught to fight for a good outcome for his or her client, regardless of whether the outcome is truly righteous or just. Well, I abhorred the caveat emptor nature of the law, buyer beware. I understand that's the way the teaching and the practice of law needs to be. It's not the way I wanted to spend my life professionally. Each and every day, marching between home and Columbia Law School, twice each day, I passed the local Republican headquarters. Not surprisingly, above the local saloon. Much to the horror of my family, who did not consider politics to be the realm of a gentleman, I inquired about becoming involved, was embraced by the young men there. They ran me successfully for the New York General Assembly. I was elected its youngest member at the age of 23. And as I left for Albany, the state capital, to take the oath of office, the erroneous words of one of my cousins were still ringing in my ears. He said, "Theodore, don't you understand the Greek etymology of the word politics? Poly meaning many, and ticks being blood-sucking insects." Off to Albany I went. I was soon there known as the Cyclone Assemblyman, the man with the sun in his face. Happy indeed in great part, because life offers no greater reward than working hard at work worth doing. Happier still for the fact that Alice and I were expecting our first child. Happy was the day when the telegram came to the floor in Albany, announcing that Alice and I were the parents of a healthy baby girl. Congratulations were all about. Even my political opponents were happy for me. But then a second and most ominous telegram came. That telegram sent me for the train, on the train down the Hudson Valley, racing to my family home in the middle of the night, the home in which Father had died 6 years prior. Brother Elliot answered the door with these words. He said, "There is a curse upon this house. Mother is dying, and Alice is too." On the morning of February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, 1884, my dear sweet widowed mother, Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt, the Rose of Roswell, Georgia, she died of typhoid fever, the dirty water disease. That afternoon, beneath the same roof and in my arms, my dear sweet bride Alice, she but 22, and a new mother. She died of Bright's disease, a kidney disease, treatable by modern medicine. There is nothing in my diary that day but a large black X. And the words, "The light has gone out of my life." I thought forever. A friend wrote of the twin funeral 2 days later. Theodore knows neither what he does nor says. But I was a man of the Christian faith, and my faith told me my loved ones were not gone, but rather gone before. And I took courage from the words of my late father, who said, "Dark care seldom sits behind the rider whose pace is swift enough. Get action." Action I got. I had the baby named Alice for her late mother, cared for by my sister Anna. Anna, now 28 years old, and not married. We called that a spinster, an old maid in those days. Not much in the way of prospects, matrimonial for Anna, since her small childhood. A gross deformity, a curvature of the spine, a hunchback, that we now believe to be tuberculosis of the spine. Poor thing spent most of her childhood in painful braces. Anna could now have that which she previously couldn't, a family. She could give baby Alice a home, something I could not be expected to do as a young widowed gentleman in my day. My sister Anna, married at the age of 42, gave birth to my nephew at the age of 43. Some historians say she would have made a better president than her brother. I do not dispute the theory. She would serve as a wonderful aide and counselor from the time when I was a student at Harvard, and she took care of my needs, sending me things by express, or to the time when I was in the White House and she lived nearby, and I would often walk from my White House to her house to receive her counsel. I threw myself into the work in the General Assembly. The session concluded, returned to New York City and saw to family affairs, and then took the train west to Chicago. Participated in my first Republican National Convention, leading the effort successfully with my new friend Henry Cabot Lodge of Boston, to see the first man of color, Congressman John Lynch of Mississippi, a former slave, seated as a temporary chairman of a great National Party convention, Lincoln's Party. The convention concluded, I did not return east to New York City, but took the train so much further west, to where that newly constructed Northern Pacific Railroad crossed the Little Missouri in the Badlands of what was then Dakota Territory, where the previous fall, in the after excitement of a successful bison hunt, I'd written a check for $14,000 to purchase 450 head of Minnesota cattle, and to hire men to be my cattle ranch foreman. When I returned in the summer of '84, the cattle had wintered well. The calving season was prosperous. But the Chimney Butte Ranch, my first, also known as the Maltese Cross, it was hemmed in by other ranches along the busy Medora Deadwood Trail. I wanted to put hundreds, if not thousands, of more cattle onto the free government grass. My neighbors told me of some bottomlands about 30 miles north of Medora, downstream on the Little Missouri. Without a neighbor for 10 or 12 miles, plenty of grass and fresh water, and in one spot, a mighty stand of cottonwood trees, sufficient in quality and quantity to build a nice ranch house and ancillary buildings. And this latter fact likely explains why I invited Sewell and Dow out from the northwoods of Maine to run my second ranch. Neither man had any experience with cattle. I don't think Bill Sewell had ever sat a horse. Both men had ridden the logs down the Penobscot during the lumber drives, and during 5 extended trips that I took to the northwoods of Maine following my father's death and prior to my marriage, these men had shown themselves boon companions, honest as the day is long, hard-working as beavers, mighty with the axe, skilled in woodcraft. Those men could help me chop down those trees and help me build those buildings. Oh, more likely I could help them, but I thought myself a decent fellow with the axe. That is until a day of chopping with Sewell and Dow. We returned to the cowboy camp at dusk, where one of the cowboys inquired of young Wilmot how we'd done. I know Will did not know that I was within earshot, for he replied, "Bill cut down 53 trees, I cut down 49, and the boss, he beavered down 17. Many were the adventures I had along the Little Missouri and hunting in the regions of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming beyond. The story of the boat thieves is a favorite. Up at the Elkhorn Ranch in the late March of '86, the ice dam had just gone downstream on the Little Missouri. In those days, when the ice dam broke and flowed downstream, the entire valley floor was dynamic with great shards of ice and boulders, a torrent of mud and shrubbery. I tied my boat to the porch to keep my boat from being taken downstream by the melt. I had a boat on the Little Missouri River. As the O'Keefes and others know, you might wonder, most months we can walk right across the Little Missouri, but when that river's in freshet in the spring or frozen solid as a steel bar in midwinter, a flat-bottomed scow comes in mighty handy to transport supplies across the river. I'd done some hunting on the east side of the river, hung the deer carcasses in the trees, into which the mountain lions got. I was going on a mountain lion hunt, intending to use my boat in support of the hunt. That is, until the pre-dawn darkness the morning of the proposed hunt. Sewell came into the kitchen. He said, "Boss, we're not going hunting." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Your boat's been stolen." I raced out into the morning gloom and saw that the rope tying the boat to the porch had been cut by a knife. A red mitten of one of the thieves dropped in the snow. I suspected, and correctly so, Redhead Mike Finnegan. He and two dim-witted cohorts living in the rough country up above my ranch. Suspected of being horse and cattle thieves by my neighbors, they decided to steal my boat in an attempt to escape the territory before my neighbors fitted them all for new neckties. I was so livid, I wanted to get on my horse Manitou, ride after, pursue, and arrest the boat thieves. I was duty-bound to do so. I was, ex officio, a deputy sheriff of Billings County, Dakota Territory, as a result of being elected president of the Little Missouri Stockmen's Association. Common sense and Sewell prevailed. He said, "Boss, you'll never get close enough to those men to arrest them, the valley floor full of ice." He knew I would not commit summary justice and execute men over a stolen boat. He proposed that he and Dow build a second boat with which to pursue the boat thieves. Well, the building of the boat was done quickly enough, but a blizzard settled in on the ranch. It was a week before we put off into the Little Missouri in pursuit of the boat thieves. Well, no one's ever gone downstream faster than two men who've grown up along the Penobscot. Sewell and Dow, each man swiftly pulling us downstream. There was nothing practical for me to do of any assistance, but lie in the bottom of the boat wrapped in buffalo robes, reading. Our third day out, up about Cherry Creek, dumping into the Little Mo, up by what is today the north unit of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, I saw smoke rising from a camp, in which one of the dimwits was doing a very poor job of guarding the camp. But we surprised, arrested, and laid bait that man, concealing ourselves beneath the cut bank, waiting for the return of Finnegan, the only dangerous man of the three, and the other fellow, empty-handed from a hunt. An Indian party had gone through the territory the previous week. There was very little in the way of game. We were on very low rations even by this point. We jumped up over the cut bank. I leveled my Winchester at Finnegan's chest. Sewell and Dow, each man on my flank with a scattergun. "Hands up," I roared. Finnegan did the math, put his hands up. We took away enough weapons from those three men to arm a platoon. But we were now in a conundrum. We had 3 prisoners and 2 boats. We could not bind the hands nor the feet of our prisoners. The entire reason that we've caught up to them is that the temperature dropped precipitously. They would have lost circulation if we bound them. The ice dam was making very little progress downstream. We finally decided. I sent Sewell and Dow, each man downstream with a boat. I requisitioned a prairie schooner, a wagon from the only ranching operation nearby. I did not trust the driver. Somehow he'd known Finnegan previously. So for 2 days and a night, with those men in the wagon, I marched behind through the frozen tundra and rose bushes of the prairie, turned the boat thieves into the sheriff's office in Dickinson, much to the consternation of the sheriff, who wondered why I had not simply hanged the prisoners upon their capture and saved him the paperwork. Some of you know there's nothing so good for the inside of a man or a woman as the outside of a horse. Riding my horse Manitou across the buttes and through the coulees of the Badlands, hunting in the regions beyond, even my great sadness was healed, at least somewhat. I would write my sisters in New York City, informing them that I would come to visit to see to family affairs and to avoid some of the bitterest of the Dakota winter. In those letters, I instructed my sisters that when I visited, under no circumstance should my old childhood sweetheart, Edith Carroll, be anywhere about. I was a Victorian. I did not approve of second marriages. I did not want to be tempted. Thank goodness, sisters don't always do what brothers ask them to do. On one return visit there in La Parada was Edith. We began to see each other socially, became secretly engaged. And nearly 3 years after my first wife's sad passing, Edith and I eloped and were married at St. George's, Hanover Square, London, England. Returning to the United States 9 months and 3 weeks after the wedding, Ted Jr. was born. The first of 5 children Mrs. Roosevelt and I would have together. We took the baby Alice back into our care when she was but a toddler, breaking my sister Patty's heart. Fast forwarding through history as you must this fine afternoon, I wonder if you realize in later years at the White House, Mrs. Roosevelt and I reared 6 children there. Mrs. Roosevelt claimed she reared 7 children there. That I was her worstest and most terrible child. Oh, I worked hard for the American people for what I called the square deal. And I said, when you work, work hard. When you play, play hard. When you work, don't play at all. But when the work day was over, I played hard. I did not have a kitchen cabinet of informal advisors like President Jackson. My informal advisors were known as members of the tennis cabinet. By invitation at the end of the workday, members of Congress, diplomats, Army, and Navy officers would come to the White House, and we would play lawn tennis on the south lawn of the White House, right where Mrs. Taft installed the rose garden. In the White House, I boxed with Army and Navy officers, wrestled, jiu-jitsu, and sumo with great bare-chested men brought over by the Japanese ambassador, and I played single stick. Mr. Kelly, have you ever played single stick, sir?
No.
Oh, it's a delightful game where men beat each other about the head with a giant wooden fence post. Great bloody fun. Entirely understandable. Man's played the sport and can't remember. The game I enjoyed most was a hiking game, an outdoor game, a game that we called point to point. A game that we played with the Roosevelt children and their cousins at our home, Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay, Long Island. And the way we played point to point in Oyster Bay was first spin a small Roosevelt child around at point A. Wherever that dizzy child came to rest and pointed, beyond the horizon was some imaginary point B, towards which we raced in single file. The rule being that whenever you came to an obstacle, a down tree, a creek, a cliff, a barn, a haystack, you never went around the obstacle, but always and only over it, under it, or through it. What makes for great dirty fun, we should play it here at Ding. I imported this game to Washington, D.C. and played the game with members of Congress, diplomats, with Army and Navy officers that showed themselves entirely too unfit physically to keep up with a fat asthmatic president racing in the woods. The most famous of my point-to-points was with the French ambassador, Jean-Jules Jusserand. Ambassador Jusserand obviously disregarded the part of the invitation that said, "Wear your dirty clothes." For he arrived wearing the finest French silks in the French court. Off we rode our horses to Rock Creek Park, dismounted, raced through the woods for several hours, eventually coming to the Potomac River, which this day was in freshet, and being a very fast, deep, and wide-running portion of the river, the French ambassador thought certainly this is our terminus, that we would return to the White House for some well-earned refreshments. But I turned to the gentlemen at Creekside and I said, "Gentlemen, let us take off our clothes, put the bundles atop our heads, swim across the river, put our clothes back on dry, and continue our hike on the cliffs opposite." Can you imagine such a thing today? I think CNN would go live from a helicopter. As we entered the water, I saw that the French ambassador, while he had this robe, he kept on his lavender kid leather gloves. I said, "Mr. Ambassador, why have you kept on your gloves?" He said, "Monsieur President, that's in case we meet any ladies." Fashions have changed along the waterfront a great deal. The head White House usher for decades, Mr. Ike Hoover, he wrote of my Roosevelt years, he said it was no time for a person with a nervous constitution to be working at the White House. 6 children, most of them small. The older boys pretending to be jack-in-the-boxes, would jump out of giant vases just as startled visitors came by, or come careening down the grand staircase riding on cookie trays stolen from the kitchen as if they were toboggans. My daughter, Alice, was 17 when we entered the White House, and her behavior was scandalous. Alice smoked cigarettes in public, flirted with Army and Navy officers, was photographed betting on the ponies at the horse races in Maryland. When the White House punch was discovered spiked, we knew who the culprit was. Alice kept a snake in her purse and introduced the snake as Emily Spinach at diplomatic dinners and receptions, sometimes wearing that little green snake as a bracelet around her wrist, a necklace around her neck. Oh, I tried. I put my foot down. I said, Alice, no daughter of mine will smoke beneath my roof. Alice was often seen smoking on the White House roof. During one afternoon conference with an old friend, Alice continuously and exuberantly interrupted. Finally, in exasperation, my friend said, Mr. President, can't you control your daughter Alice? I said, sir, I can either run the country or I can control Alice. I cannot possibly do both. Alice was famously married at the White House in 1906 to Congressman Nicholas Longworth of Cincinnati, Ohio. He, in the future, a Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, would die serving in that office in 1931 during the Hoover administration, hence the Longworth House Office Building in Washington, D.C. Oh, the wedding. Your grandparents may have played the wedding waltz, Alice's Blue Gown, in the parlor. The color, Alice Blue, a bit of a powder blue, very famous in women's fashion and home decor for decades. The wedding was a great success. The marriage was a challenge to all parties concerned. Congressman Longworth had trouble controlling Alice, she even more trouble controlling him. Longworth, when he died in 1931, was buried in his native Cincinnati. The press asked my daughter, his widow, if she too someday would be buried in Cincinnati. She replied, that would be a fate worse than death. My daughter Alice outlived all of her younger siblings, living to the age of 96 in the final year of the Carter administration. Living in her DuPont Circle apartment in the nation's capital, my daughter Alice was known as the second Washington Monument. And I do believe her personality delightfully summed up by a needlepoint message that was on a pillow on her settee. The message on the pillow said, if you don't have anything nice to say about someone, come sit next to me. I think we all know someone like Alice, I hope so. Contrasting sophisticated Alice on the other end of the family spectrum were the youngest boys, Archie and Quentin, 7 years old. As those boys grew, so did their mischief. I've got my eyes on you. How old are you? 13. Well, my youngest, Archie and Quentin, they were known as members of the White House Gang. So named by the members of the Washington, D.C. police force and the Secret Service, who were so often the targets of their shenanigans and their spitballs. One story illustrative. In the middle of winter, after a heavy midwinter snow, I left the White House for an appointment. I ascended an open-air carriage. As I did so, one Washington, D.C. police officer gave me a crisp salute. And as the tips of his fingers hit the brim of his helmet, so did a giant 30-pound snowball dropped from the White House roof. The snowball smashed through the officer's helmet and left a knockout cold in the driveway. I did not need to investigate. I turned over my shoulder. I said, boys, get down here immediately. Down the boys came. They apologized profusely, quite sincerely and effectively. They meant to frighten us for fun, not to harm anyone. I did look into the issue and I discovered that officer was long overdue for a promotion. It's good to be president. We enjoyed ourselves in the White House, and Great Pond for the White House during our years was a veritable zoo. A menagerie of animals, like you, cats and dogs, perhaps horses. I wonder if any of you at home has a pet badger? I do not recommend it. We had a one-legged rooster and a parrot that on command shouted, hurrah, for Roosevelt. The most famous of the children's pets was the calico pony Algonquin, a Shetland. We had stables next to the White House in those days. One morning, Quentin, the youngest, brought the pony Algonquin, muddy hooves and all, into the front door of the White House, down the hallway, into the freight elevator, up the freight elevator on the second floor, down the hallway, and into his brother Archie's bedroom. They were rather easy to track and discover. Asked why he brought the pony into the White House, Quentin explained that his brother Archie wasn't feeling well. He knew that he would feel better if he could just see his favorite pony. I can't explain the science and the medicine of the thing, but Archie did get better. Well, I hope there's something of my 7½ years as your president that you might still appreciate today. I'm afraid that I'm being forgotten. I did my best to march over from the Boone property before being rescued by the Harkeys on the way. Well, I was going about, and one small group of young boys on their bicycles came by. I had my top hat. One young man pointed at me and told his friends, he said, "Look, there's the Monopoly dude." If he knew his history half as well as you, he would have known I was the anti-Monopoly dude. The great trust buster. Just ask J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Harriman, and others. I am known as your conservation president for the fact that during my administration I declared or legislated with Congress 230 million acres of national parks, national forests, wildlife refuges, and national monuments, created the Reclamation Service, dammed 30 western rivers, providing for the irrigation of millions of arid acres. On March 14th, 1903, tomorrow will be the anniversary. On that date, I declared Pelican Island, off the coast of Sebastian, as our first federal bird sanctuary, now regarded as our first national wildlife refuge. And before the end of my administration, I declared 51 such bird sanctuaries, including here nearby, Matlacha Pass, Island Bay, and Pine Island, constituent parts of Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge, named for my friend from Des Moines, Ding Darling, who during Franklin's administration would be appointed the head of the Biological Survey, the predecessor to the Fish and Wildlife Service. I thought the most important work of my administration was the Panama Canal. It had been a vision of mankind since the explorations of Balboa 4 centuries prior to my administration. Completed in 1914, the Panama Canal cut to 1/3 the amount of time necessary to move our great naval assets from one ocean to the other, and demonstrated successfully to the powers of Asia and Europe that the United States Navy could do in peacetime what might be necessary to do in wartime. The Nobel Peace Prize, awarded to me for settling the Russo-Japanese War with the Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, doubtlessly saving hundreds of thousands of lives between the two combatant nations. The Medal of Honor, awarded to me posthumously more than a century after the action in Cuba. Every officer in the field recommended me for the citation, denied me for politics, most historians believe. Oh, well, all of it. The Pure Food and Drug Act, federal meat inspection, railroad rate regulation, all of it, so much dust in the windy streets of history. A near conclusion, I must admit. I think I'm actually best remembered not for a legacy of success and achievement, but for the legacy of a failure. A failed bear hunt in the delta of Mississippi. I'd been invited there in the fall of 1902 by my friends from Mississippi and Louisiana to help settle a boundary dispute. In those years when the Mississippi River flooded and the waters abated, new little abutments or islands of land would be created by the receding waters. And the neighboring states would argue, dispute who had jurisdiction to regulate and, most importantly, tax for the purpose of revenue those new lands. I was brought down to settle the dispute and to have a good bear hunt, which we did not have. For my friends from Mississippi and Louisiana, amongst the latter, my Rough Rider friend, J.A. McElhenny. You might enjoy the Tabasco pepper sauce his family still makes in Adriana, Louisiana. Well, they tried to outdo themselves with regards to the expression of Southern hospitality. Those of you who hunt will understand. You can either have a good hunt or a good picnic. You generally cannot have them both at the same time, in the same place. We scared every bear out of the Delta, I'm sure. On the third night, the famous hunting guide, Hope Collier of Greenville, Mississippi, he who in his youth had been slave, body master to his servant to his owner during the Civil War, Hope Collier killed a Union captain during the occupation of Vicksburg. Charges dismissed by a sympathetic Southern jury. By the time we met in 1902, Mr. Collier had over 1,000 bear to his credit. He came into camp that third night and said, "Mr. President, I shall have you a bear by morning if I need to bring him into camp at the end of a rope," and we all laughed. The next morning, Collier and I went out early, but we found no trail, no spoor whatsoever returning to camp. Where later, to my tent, I heard men yelling and dogs barking, a man blowing a bugle. I raced out from my tent, and there indeed Mr. Collier had tethered an old wounded male bear to a tree. It was an adult male, light, about 180 pounds, that had been trout and little in the way of food. My horror was compounded when one of my hunting party said, "Mr. President, there's your bear. Go ahead and shoot your bear." What a cowardly thing that would have been to do. I had founded Boone and Crockett, the nation's first fair hunting and conservation organization, a decade and a half prior. I'd served as president of Boone and Crockett for years before I became president of the U.S. of A. I refused to shoot that bear. And instead of being forgotten as I would want, the story spread by telegram and newspaper. And the cartoonist Clifford Berryman, my friend, did me no favor when he drew a cartoon of the incident, called it "Drawing the Line in Mississippi." The cartoon showed me refusing to shoot a small bear cub tied to a tree. When I returned to the White House, I received there a letter from the Michtom family, small candy makers, toy manufacturers in Brooklyn, New York. Mrs. Michtom, in her letter to me, asking permission to make a stuffed bear and to name it after me. I wrote back, I said, "You may go ahead and do so, but I don't think it will help your sales very much at all." Well, apparently the sales of what they called Teddy's Bear, with the apostrophe possessive S, were pretty good because the Michtoms became the world-famous Ideal Toy Company of New York City. The toy manufacturers, enthused by the unexpected profits that came from the sale of Teddy's Bear, they thought they might equally profit if they made a stuffed animal and named it in honor of each and every subsequent resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House. But I'm afraid, in honor of William Howard Taft and for the toy manufacturers, America's mothers never really took kindly to putting Billy the Possum in with the children at night. Can you imagine such a horrid, buck-toothed, long-nosed thing? Give the children nightmares. The teddy bear reigns supreme. And young man, today, for bringing down the average age in attendance today, you're never too old for a teddy bear, even when you're a teenager. That's for you. Take them off on the bench. Don't put them on the shelf now. Take them off into the swamps, get them put in muddy and torn up. There's no adventure like the adventure of the outdoors. And so my thanks to the Ding Darling Wildlife Society, the Friends of Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge, to my friends, the O'Keefes, Bill and Heather O'Keefe from Grand Forks, North Dakota, who have helped to sponsor the lectures held today. You realize that when I left the White House, I was about 50 years old. There was no presidential pension. 6 children, a growing number of grandchildren. I had to work to earn a living. I edited the Outlook magazine. I wrote newspaper and magazine articles, published books, made speeches in exchange for remuneration. I've never made Clinton money, but I'm doing all right. I'm well fed anyway. I was the first president to make permanent office space available for members of the press at the White House, something I'm sure many of my successors deeply regret. But I'd be remiss. Perhaps there's some point of history or policy during my administration, anything about my family, a vignette with which you're familiar that you had not heard this afternoon. Anyone at all? Any curiosity? Yes, thank you, madam, and then I'll come to you. Please.
In a book written by African guy from Teddy Roosevelt's son, I was surprised. I read all the details. It was awesome. Unfortunately, I got sick. Do you have any memory of that?
Oh, most certainly. So the years were 1909 and 1910. Kermit and I left New York Harbor about March 23rd. We used to inaugurate the new president on March 4th. This is less than 3 weeks following the inauguration. I wanted to give Taft room to grow into the office, so to say. It wouldn't be fair if every time he made a speech or had an initiative in Congress, if the press came running up to Sagamore Hill to see what the colonel had to say. So when we left New York Harbor, I told the members of the press that any member of the Fourth Estate that followed us onto the savannas of Africa, we would capture and turn over to whichever the local tribes still practiced cannibalism. It left us rather unmolested. We were over a year in British East Africa. Today that's Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Sudan. We were collecting for the Smithsonian Institution. I would meet Mrs. Roosevelt in Khartoum. We would tour Europe, spoke at the great universities. I attended the funeral of my friend King Edward VII in London. I marched behind all of the golden epaulets and ostrich feathers of ostentatious European monarchy, wearing my small Republican civilian suit. I spoke at the great universities, and including in 1910 at the Sorbonne, the University of Paris. I made a speech there called Citizenship in a Republic. These are remarks that I drafted while hunting in Africa. I shan't recite the speech in its entirety, but a short portion of that speech remains famous to this day. I'm told that Tom Brady used these words to rally his patriots in the locker room, that LeBron James writes down some of these words on his tennis shoes before the game, basketball shoes. I'm told that Miley Cyrus has some of these words tattooed somewhere. And I share them with you, for your being here now, and many of you being involved in the Friends of Ding Darling, well, you're about doing good deeds, aren't you? Good deeds for conservation and wildlife, good deeds for education, historic preservation, good deeds for the arts and more. Well, this is America, where no good deed goes unpunished. Certainly no good deed goes without its second-guessing, its Monday morning quarterbacking, its criticism. Persist in your good deeds. And when criticized, take heart and remember what I shared with a French over a century ago and with you here this afternoon. Remember, it is not the critic who counts. Not the man who points out how the strong man stumbled or where the doer of deeds might have done them better. The credit belongs to the man, and today to the woman, who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who actually does the deed, who knows the great devotions, who spends herself in a worthy cause, who in the end, at the best, knows the triumph of high achievement, who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. My, that must have been a painful tattoo. Madam, the lady's got a question, and I'll come to you. Please.
What if you elaborate a bit more on Alice Longer and try to associate her with Eleanor Roosevelt?
Oh, there's a wonderful book called Hissing Cousins about my daughter Alice and her cousin Eleanor. I gave Eleanor away at her March 17th, 1905 wedding to Cousin Franklin. Cousin Franklin, we're fifth cousins once removed. I'm a generation older. 5 generations before me, our forebears were cousins, but of course, Eleanor is my niece. On their wedding, you realize that a Roosevelt was marrying a Roosevelt. Eleanor did not need to change the monogram on her towels. I congratulated Franklin on keeping the name in the family. There were others there that were glad that the money was kept in the family as well. But it was during the election of 1924 in New York when Ted Jr. was the Republican nominee for the governorship. Now that was the election of President Coolidge. He became the second vice president to accede to the presidency upon the death of the president to be elected in his own right. I'm the first to have done so when I was elected in 1904 by the largest electoral vote and popular vote plurality in our history. Every other vice president succeeding a president who died in office was unable to secure election in his own right. The 1924 election, Ted the Republican nominee, but Franklin and Eleanor dedicated to the democracy. Eleanor followed her cousin Ted around the campaign trail, driving a Buick, atop which the Plumbers and Pipe Fitters Union and the Democratic Party had installed a giant steaming teapot to remind the voters that Ted Jr. was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the Teapot Dome scandal, which eventually sent Secretary Flaw to prison, the only member of the cabinet to be indicted and convicted under federal law and sent to prison. Did someone just say that's not enough? Well, it was one. The time of reconciliation came during World War II, when Eleanor, now not only serving as First Lady, but really redefining the role, traveling throughout the country and with great empathy for the poor and people of color, really being the eyes and ears of the Roosevelt administration for Cousin Franklin. Eleanor would invite Alice to the White House, where Alice would then, in front of Eleanor's guests, do her impression of her cousin Eleanor. Let's just say that Eleanor had a good sense of humor about it. And they worked together in the war effort during World War II. And now, subsequently, as a result of the schism of 1924 being overcome, every 2 years, the Roosevelts of Oyster Bay, Long Island, the Republicans and the Roosevelts of Hyde Park, New York, they get together for family reunions, the hatchet being buried. But any study of Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, is a worthwhile study. The expectations now of First Ladies being so much more than during my time. My wife, Edith, of course, was a great force behind the scenes. On New Year's Eve, on New Year's Day, 1905, we had the tradition then of the President being available for a public reception. And after all of the diplomats and the members of Congress, any American citizen could come and shake the President's hand. On that morning and early afternoon, I shook 8,500 hands. They say I pulled them along and held the Guinness Book of World Records until the mayor of Atlantic City, New Jersey, one July 4th, shook hands going down the boardwalk with both hands. The entire first 3 hours, Mrs. Roosevelt stood by my side, holding a bouquet of flowers. She didn't have to shake a single hand. And there was the lady in the hat. Please.
Mr. President.
Madam. My friends call me Colonel. Please do so.
I just wanted to tell you how greatly you're venerated in our family. You appointed my husband's great uncle, Thomas Nelson Page, to be the ambassador to Italy. Unfortunately, President Wilson sent him home after a while and told him that he was important. He was chosen to be ambassador of the United States, for the United States, not the ambassador to Italy.
Oh, they do talk about going native.
But what I do want to ask you, would you please give us what you envision to be, how you would have handled World War I?
Oh, fascinating. Well, I was a critic of Wilson's cowardly response to the sinking of the Lusitania. You may recall, he wrote a letter of protest to Kaiser Wilhelm II, stating that that was a horrible thing, and if they ever did it again, he'd be quite irate about it. Madam, I said in public, it was as if I was walking down the street with my wife. Now, if a man attacked my wife violently, do you think I would simply write a letter of protest to the man? Would I throttle him? When Wilson was re-elected in 1916, under that terrible yellow phrase, he kept us out of war. I mentioned we inaugurated in March. By mid-April, we were at war with Germany, and I think Wilson understood. It was a war in which we would need to engage in a war in which Wilson left us entirely unprepared. My friends in Congress had passed a resolution stating that I should be allowed to raise a division of cavalry and lead that cavalry across the fields of France and into the German machine guns. Come to think of it, perhaps it weren't just my friends that voted in the affirmative on the resolution. Prior to war being declared, I came from my last hunting adventure. Late March, early April of 1917, I took the train to Punta Gorda. I took a boat and met my host, J. Russell Coles, a tobacconist from Danville. In his hobby was ichthyology, the study of the large fish. He invited me to come and hunt the manta ray, the devilfish, which we did by harpoon. We camped on a little boat in between Captiva and Pine Island, and now you know the origin of Roosevelt chant in the waters nearby. I did not want to come because there was so much important conversation going on in Washington, D.C. But Coles assured me that I'd have a manta ray within hours of my arrival, and that's the way it worked. It's my last hunting or fishing adventure because once war was declared, if a man didn't need to hunt or fish to put food on the table, it was recreation. And I wouldn't be recreating at a time when the country was at war. I went to the White House to ask Wilson for my commission. He looked at me and through me and said, President Roosevelt, we now have professional soldiers to do that sort of thing. As I left the White House in frustration, I turned to Colonel House, Wilson's military aide. I said, doesn't the president realize that I just offered to lead my life in France for my country? Colonel House reflected and asked, did you make that entirely clear to him? You might know that Wilson's summer home in New Jersey was called Shadow Lawn. And I said, there are many shadows. The shadows of the dead innocents at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The innocent women and children that were killed by the German U-boats. Sometimes in history we play the contrapositive, the what if. What if I had been elected president in 1912 instead of Wilson? Do you think the Germans would have had open U-boat warfare on American shipping when I was the American president? I don't think so. But it is sadly a contrapositive. In 1916, I turned down the endorsement of the Progressive Party to run for president. My running mate would have been the Democratic future governor of Louisiana, Colonel John Parker. Would have been what they call a fusion ticket, a Republican and a Democrat. I endorsed the Republican from New York. I thought it so important to defeat Wilson. I died, for those of you that haven't read ahead, I died January 6, 1919. At the time of my death, I was the leading candidate for the Republican nomination in 1920. The convention produced Harding after some 20-some ballots. The two men who had the most amount of votes in the first balloting, General Leonard Wood, my commanding officer in Cuba, for whom the Army fought in Missouri is named. At Plattsburgh, New York in 1915 and 1916, he ran the preparedness camp that was held at Plattsburgh, which 3 of my 4 sons attended. The other man getting the second highest number of votes at that 1920 convention was Hiram Johnson, the Republican governor of California, who had been my running mate on the progressive ticket in 1912. Had either one of those Roosevelt progressive Republicans endorsed the other, there would have been no President Harding, thus no Vice President Coolidge, no Coolidge presidency. Again, sadly, the contrapositive. I've prattled on. It's almost a filibuster now, isn't it? I'll stay after, but in the meanwhile, please, keep your eyes on the stars and your feet planted firmly on the ground. Well, believe you can, and you're halfway there, and finally, for yourselves, your family, for Ding Darling, and for the Republic. Do what you can with what you have, where you are. And please, your time and attention to my host from the Ding Darling National Wildlife Society, the Friends of Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge, Ms. Anne Marie Wild. Please give Anne Marie a little attention, please.
This is the book written by Ed O'Keefe that you want to read. It is sold in our bookstore and sold right out here at the table this afternoon. Fabulous book.
The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, a real page turner.
And a special thank you, Bill, Heather. We so appreciate everything you do. You support us through many, many things, but thank you for sponsoring this particular topic. This is our final lecture of the 2025 season. However, we're in the works of putting together a blockbuster season for next year, 2026. By that time, the visitor center will be fully open again with our air conditioning and the heating for anybody who did attend any of the lectures. You know we need both of those. And so we'll have a brand new system of air conditioning. The ceilings will be lower, there'll be a new lighting system put in, so it'll be a whole new look inside. In the meantime, the nature store and the front desk, the welcome desk, are always open at least till June. So do come in and visit them. But thank you again. If anyone would like to sponsor a talk for next year, just see myself, Jeff, or any one of the other Ding Darling people here. Thank you so much for joining us. This is what makes it possible for us.
Thank you all so very much.